Welcome everybody. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm Director of Instruction for Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our ongoing TRC 57 speaker series. I'd like to acknowledge right now that my office sits on the beautiful traditional territory of the Nanaimo people. We're on the traditional territory of the Halkali'nam speaking people of Tsumenis, Snanawas, and Tsumenis peoples here. As I mentioned, I'm Director of Instruction for Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, and I am joining you today with my two colleagues and friends, Stephanie Johnson and Lawrence Mitchell. I'd like to turn over our meeting to, as we usually do, to Tom Clotton, to Lawrence, to set the stage, welcome our ancestors, our great-grandchildren, and the land on which we stand, to set the stage for our learnings today.
Hi, Debka. Aichka, Tita, CM, the Tanaquail. Aichka at the Hayal Ait Squail. The Ihwam Atmastal, Aquata Ait Squallowans at the Thema CIs. The Ihwam say with Amsh, Equam Comstuch Tan Squallowans at the Elite Nashwalaqua. Ibiatan Quaswa Kikalis Ikaki Nastima. Ihwam Stratakanstoch Donat Holmach. Die hom lalamathet sep at the salchanst ite schwawelitst ite zwananst. Heichka kwatstwa ia tanatamach atanaquel ite maxwell. Now a squam quums danasali titel the heichka.
Ichka, my brother, your ability to remind us of our connections to creation is always greatly appreciated. I love those. Yeah, that's a special ability you have. Welcome, everybody. Our TRC 57 speaker series has been part of our school district's efforts to understand the teachings of this land, to understand the teachings of this territory in particular, so that we can better serve the students who attend our schools. And as an organization, walk better on this territory through the teachings of ancestors that live in people like Lawrence. So when he has shared those songs and those prayers, it reminds us that there's been teachings on this territory for thousands of years. And so it's through this NLPS TRC 57 speaker series that we seek better to understand not only the teachings from this territory, but some of the understandings that rise to the surface across this nation, so that we're better able to walk here in a good way. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Sébastien Malette from Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University. Professor Malette is an author, and though we've had only a few moments to chat, he strikes me as a person who's curious about things that we're curious about, identity and relationships, diversity, sense of belonging, how we go about this path of reconciliation, and discovering new ways to be in the world. We've been blessed with a number of authors through the generosity of Carrie Kilmartin at UBC Press, so I raise my hands to her. And I also am pleased to welcome Professor Malette to our TRC 57 speaker series. Welcome, Sébastien.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that song and that prayers. It has a soothing and calming effects. And I will take that spirit, hopefully, in the conversation forward, so that we can be blessed with openings, healing, and the opportunity to have better relationships with us all. For what I'd like to introduce today to you is a difficult subject, is a subject with a lot of lateral violence, unfortunately, and a lot of misunderstanding. But I'm hopeful that with better information, better hearts, and an open mind, we can travel to great distance toward better, toward a place for all to coexist, and for us to go beyond and above colonialisms and the ability to respect the path of everyone that has been impacted by colonialisms in ways that are often unsuspected. And so these points I like to bring to clarification. So I'm very grateful today for that opportunity to speak to you. I will now share some of my PowerPoints. So it's technology time, which I'm not an expert into, but I think I can share my screen by doing this. And then my presentation by clicking on this share button here. And hopefully you guys are seeing the presentation. And if I'm going, I don't know if I'm going into a slideshow, will I just cover my screen completely or not?
Yeah, you can go on a slideshow.
Okay, great. So it's better for my eyes, right, to express that feeling. So I think we have 55 minutes or so together. I'm quite optimistic by nature, so I have prepared for you an amount of like 25 slides. Don't worry, don't panic. It's possible for me to glide through these slides quicker. It's just a material that I like to bring to you in terms of pictures, in terms of quotes that I think will be useful to understand our subject. But I will try to stay as close as I can from my PowerPoint presentations so as not to digress too much in the conversations on these topics. So this is the cover of the book, Bois-Brûlés, The Untold Story of the Métis of Western Quebec. This book here that I hold in my hands, published in 2020. So, and I can speak later about this wonderful woman that stands on the cover of this book. Mary Keith Taylor, the wife of Métis person from Red River, in fact, Thomas Taylor, that used to live on the Rivière La Lièvre, very not far from my home, actually. I could easily drive there. And they lived there for a numbers of years with other Métis families of the region. So we've put this amazing picture found in the archives on the cover of our book to really highlight the possibility of renewed relationship and the possibility to see also the amazing strength of a Métis woman, especially in this culture, that we're carrying so much of it forward. So it is a testimony of Métis people getting together from Red River, from the West, but also with Eastern Métis families that used to live together into environments, struggling together, striving together. And this is, in our minds, a reminder of this. So this is just a quick snapshot about the pictures. Now I'm gonna try my arrows on my computer. Yes, it works, so that's great. First, I would like to acknowledge that the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public School are located on the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw. So this is truly important for me to acknowledge this. And the Snanawas, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I hope, and the Stenamas First Nations. Being from the East Coast, I'm not used to the name of your nation, so I apologize if I have mispronounced your nation. I'm trying to do my utter best here. And I also acknowledge the Métis citizen from Mid-Island Métis Nation who have a home base in Snuneymuxw territory, and also the many Métis joining us today from all across these beautiful lands. So this is acknowledgement that I like to do at the beginning, and I will also like to offer thanks prior to getting into any conversations. I think it's always good to be along the lines of gratitude, as this is a safe passage towards so many things in so many places. So I would like to offer my thanks to the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools for organizing this, and also to the organizer, Stephanie Johnson. I know, Stephanie, I've put you in some difficult position, and I'm sorry for this. I'm sorry for all the trouble that may follow me along the subject of research that I'm doing. Also, a special thank you to Carrie Kilmartin, Ted Cadwalder, and Lawrence Mitchell, obviously, for their great prayers and opening that will hopefully protect our hearts through this subject matter. So I also like to thank my co-authors. This is not a standalone work. I'm working always in collaborations with other people, including Professor Michel Bouchard and also Mr. Guillaume Marcotte, independent historian of the Fur Trade, as well as our publishers, also for their courage. For this work, it is the Presse of l'Université Laval for the French version, and UBC Press that took this book forward in English. It has been rewritten in English, so it is not exactly the same book, but it is close enough. And I have to say that my first language is also French. You probably can notice by my thick accent. So if there's any word that I may have difficulty with, I sincerely apologize. At home with the kids and with the family, my two kids are now in school, Kali and Midrik. And my wife, Natasha, is working right now in clinics in order to help trauma survivors. So it's French at home and it's English at work. So hopefully in the future, it'll be also, more Indigenous language heading up to these types of conversations, which I think are greatly needed. Finally, I'd like to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council that have, offer funds for this research. And finally, also the Métis community of Maniwaki, with whom we are working in close collaborations for all of this work, always in partnership with the community, obviously, even if these communities are not recognized actually by the federal government or provincial government or by a numbers of other actors. We like to work in collaborations with what we believe is an ostracized community and a community that is left left behind, so to speak, and we would like to bring them forward the light. Another heartfelt thanks to Michel Noel that has now started his spirit journey. Michel has left us a few weeks ago. He did the foreword for the book. So in this book, you will find the foreword because we thought it's really important to give the people from the community the first possibility to speak before we put any research forward. So the foreword, we asked Michel Noel, who wrote books on Métis, Eastern Métis culture, and the Outaouais Métis in particular, including a very fantastic children's book in French for understanding better Métis culture, which I have used for my own family. So I've just put it a quote from Michel that I would like to read in his memory to you. I may read bad, so hopefully you can look at your screen and reading at the same time. So I'm quoting him. I read and reread Bois-Brûlés with passion. This ethno-historical study sheds a dazzling light on my ancestor, the Métis of the Gatineau Valley. It allows me to recognize myself as never before and to understand with greater clarity where I came from and who I am. Through these words, I saw once again the beautiful landscape of my childhood, I vividly recall it, time spent on the shore of the majestic Outaouais, Gatineau, and the Lièvre River, and at the Gat-Bonga Reservoir near Great Lake Victoria. This rich telling reminds me of the exceptional men, women, and children I knew then. They were larger than life and forever dwell in my memory. In Bois-Brûlés, I recognize the name of my family, grandparents, uncle, aunts, and friends. I discover facts and locals that give comfort to my identity. Bois-Brûlés is in many ways my biography, and the characters who inhabit this work are central to my lived past, my family tree, and that of hundreds of inhabitants of the Gatineau Valley, end of quotes. So I'm just gonna start here my alarm, so I'm not getting in trouble in terms of time-wise. Apologies for that taking is working. So you can see now the appreciations of Michel Noel for the living culture. And I like to really take a moment to underline the importance of kinship in this passage and the importance of culture, the importance of locations and relationships as well. So we are right from the get-go, so to speak, away from any conversations that would be merely race-based or just distant ancestry, for an example, when we have living testimonies of that kind of impact. So as a way to break the ice, so to speak, I bring you right into what we called in our jargon RCAP, or RRCAP, basically, which stands for the Report of the Royal Commissions on Aboriginal People. It was published in 1997 after years of studies and research. It was a report compiled to shed light on the situation of Indigenous people across Canada. It is a very substantive report of many books. And in the volume 4 of that collections stand a part about the Eastern Métis, or what is called the other Métis. I'm bringing this to you because there's a lot of tensions about this subject right now. I will expose some of these tensions so to understand the context of the book that I'm presenting to you today, and hopefully some teachings across that so that we can understand the value of better relationships and to understand the the positive impacts of fact-based conversations about this, respect, tolerance, and mutual growth, so to speak. So we can see that in 1997, when that report was published, and it's online for you to read it, I have chosen a quote from that report that highlights what are the other Métis, just to say that, against some of my opponents at this point, which are pretty vocal about this, I'm being told that I'm inventing the subject of Eastern Métis, that I would be kind of a magician, that with a magic wand, I would create all of a sudden these subject matters, and I would be, that this would be hurtful for the real Indigenous people, the real Métis people, or the First Nations or the Inuit concerned. So I just want to bring this quote to say that I am not inventing this. I am pursuing this research in line with the recommendation of RCAP, formulated 20 years plus ago. So I'm just quoting really rapidly for your better understanding of the situation. Several Métis communities, I quote, came into existence independently of the Métis nation in the eastern parts of what we now call Canada, some of them predating the establishment of the Métis nation. The history of the Métis people who are not part of the Métis nation is not easy to relate. For one thing, their past has not been much studied by historians. If the Métis Nation story is unfamiliar to most Canadians, the story of the other Métis is almost untold. For another thing, their story is made up of several largely unconnected segments, each relating to a different geographical area. We can provide only the briefest sketch for each of the area involved. They talk about the report here. I keep quoting. Each sketch represents a complex history that has yet to be studied in details. And I will stop my quote here. I just want to highlight you here on the side screen. You can see their past has not been studied much by historians. This is what we try to do. We try to honor the recommendation of the Royal Commissions on Aboriginal People, which most of the authors were Indigenous people, and we're trying to push this further as a promise toward reconciliation and the possibility to exist and coexist together. That being said, a conclusion also from that report, and I'm hiding that quote here, even if they were looked upon, I quote, as an homogeneous collectivity, other Métis would constitute a minority within a minority within a minority. They are a neglected fragments of Canada's Métis population, which is itself a small and too often overlooked part of the larger Aboriginal minority. Other Métis are not an homogeneous collectivity. Of course, they include many discrete communities or groups. And here's the last part of that quote, which I think is very important for us. It's few Canadians, I quote, are more exposed by their ethnicity to the risk of isolation and alienation than other Métis, end of quotes. So this is a very powerful statement about the situation that was already true decades ago about the situation about the other Métis, and the situation is not any better today. In fact, I would argue that it's in fact worse due to social media and other political conflicts that now involve actors that vehemently oppose the recognitions of Eastern Métis and are very determined to negate their existence. Therefore, because we are studying this subject and wish to produce quality work on this and positive conversations empowering these communities, we are ourselves as academics and researchers subject to censorship attempts, political intimidations, doxing maneuvering on social media and the like. So this is just, a word to say that it takes courage to go after the truth. It takes courage to go forward about your convictions. It is possible. It is always possible to stay on the high road as much as possible. We're humans after all. We're all fallible. We're all subject to faults and tempers. But I think it's so important that we go forward about this in a good way. And RCAP was already inviting this forward. So for you guys to understand the political and social context that currently affects the Eastern Métis, I have highlighted for you a few points, so for you to understand the complexity of doing research in this field, but also furthermore, the difficulties for these communities to exist. At this point, first point, the federal and provincial governments do not recognize the Métis east of Ontario. They have no recognitions, no service attributed to this modes of recognitions, absolutely zero. They rely on their own resources, often community resources, which are poor and destitute at this point, and are trying to survive as organizations or communities. The Métis National Council, it's no secret, after its sessions from the NCC, which was the Native Council of Canada, now the Congress of Aboriginal People, started to claim in 1983, after the constitutional conversations, that they alone would be the real Métis, so to speak. So they started these conversations and these arguments positing that the other Métis would not in fact be real Métis, that only them had acquired a sufficient degree of maturity, politically speaking, to be the real Métis, and that the other people calling themselves Métis should either find another name for themselves or just, go away and accept that they've been assimilated, so to speak. So it's a very hard conversations, but that's part of the political context that I have to highlight right off the bat. A number of First Nations as well are influential members of these nations. So it's not to overgeneralize. There's a lot of supports, including among Western Métis in Red River. There are people supporting the Eastern Métis, same as within Inuit or First Nations. We ought not to generalize. But there is a number of people in these nations that do oppose the recognitions of Eastern Métis. Among them, people from the Innu Nation, Algonquin Nation, or Mi'kmaq are pretty vocal about this right now, because due to colonial politics and statu quo, we may suspect it's really hard for them to be comforted in terms of these Indigenous people that tries to coexist, to exist. For them, trying to build relationships with Ottawa over all the years, negotiating treaty painfully, having, a token of respect, sometimes a lot of lacking respect. It's really unsettling for them to see that there are Métis people that would come to the surface and try to ask for rights themselves or agreements themselves or other forms of politics as well. So there are tensions on that hand as well. Now, within the academia, there's also an increasing movement which has been labeled academic bullying and intimidation toward the subject of Eastern Métis, unfortunately, by members aligning themselves either with First Nation politics or the MNC politics on these subjects, which brings a lot of problems in our university in negotiating with students that do identify as Eastern Métis. So all this to say that there's layers of problems at this point. And that leads to online harassment and doxing on Twitter, Facebook. I don't have to convince you of this. If you have an account, you can go, verify this information by yourself. And I think that the larger conversation I wish to have about this today is that we need to move out of this toxic culture. We need to find a language by which we respect fact-based evidence and reasoning, and that we do not need to attack one another on the personal level, and that we can build greater, better conversation if we tune in to one another. But I had a duty to be transparent with this, and these some of the political and social contexts that surround the questions of Eastern Métis. Now, the judicial context. So the path to recognitions is also for the Eastern Métis couch it into what we can call a judicial conversations, okay? And so that's not easier. On top of the political pressure there is, the Métis are now facing, since the case Paulé, which is in 2003, there was a famous case in Ontario, in Sault Ste. Marie, where Métis were granted for the first time recognitions according to the Constitution, Section 35. And so, although it was a very powerful moment for the Métis, that we're finally, liberating in terms of acknowledgement and their rights, and it's really important in terms of recognitions, it came also with a dark side that I would like to identify. One of these is that, from the previous jurisprudence as well as the scholarship on this subject, indigeneity, in large, is spoke through three main criteria, which is self-identification, because we cannot oblige anyone to have an identity if they don't want to, right? Self-identification is not just like having the power to take an identity, it is also the power to be imposing identity. So self-identification and celebrating freedom on that regard and consciousness is extremely important for all. Then comes the point that it's not just self-identification alone, it's also ancestral connections that can be demonstrated, okay? So do you have ancestral connections? It's not only by blood, it could be by adoptions and other means, including cultural means. And finally, community acceptance. So the possibility for a community to accept you, to welcome you, or for a community itself to recreate itself, it's also truly important, although there is nuance on that point that have been highlighted by the Supreme Court, again in the Daniels case in 2016, acknowledging the fact that many people had no communities, including urban Indigenous populations, people that were broken by colonialism's residential school survivors and more that were deprived of their culture. So we have to be attuned to that suffering and make sure that community acceptance doesn't come like a new path to essentialisms and a way to police each other and to bully one another to say, do you come from a real community and all of these things, okay? Because all of these criteria are fine, but they all can be weaponized in terms of hurting the legitimacy of other Indigenous people. So we have to be careful of this. So also comes with Section 35s and this massive thing in 2003, the need for Métis people to show that they have an historical community, a historical Métis community, and they need to make the demonstration of this for the courts, or else they won't have Section 35 rights, okay? Why? Because essentially Aboriginal rights are couched into this collectivist understanding of differences. And if you don't have a community or a culture that is distinct from other Canadians, why would you have any further rights or any special rights some people would claim, right? So along this jurisprudence, the notions of proving an historical community is crucial to that point, and it brings a level of stress for Eastern Métis populations, which were broken by colonialisms, and we have documentation proving that the government, in fact, interfered with the possibility for them to form communities. So we're now asking them 200 years later, 100 years later, to have communities and to demonstrate their communities when for 200 years, the government and the colonial authorities were actively seeking to destroy these communities, if you can understand that paradox. So to prove that community for experts such as I, and also the Crown is hiring expert within the field of academia to contradict our findings and things like that. So it's really agonistic. It's really tense in court for these Indigenous people to go and try to advocate for themselves. They will be scrutinized. Their genealogy will be open. Their personal history will be mocked. The Crown will use also all kinds of strategy to win, because essentially the actors in that context would like to win. But for the historical community, we have to understand that because the Métis are post-contact people, right? They were not there prior, you know, in terms of their cultural makeup, so to speak. There is the presence of European as well as Indigenous culture coming together in a unique way. So because of this, then we find the need to prove that your community has existed post-contact, yes, but prior effective control. So you have to argue, like, where did that community fit? And all the experts and anthropologists and other people are coming in and wait, like, you know, where did you exist and when did you exist? And there is huge forms of violence for any Indigenous people in person to submit themselves to that process. Without that process, however, there will be, you know, in most cases, no recognitions from governmental authorities. So if you don't go through the judicial pathways and all the publicity and the violence that is attached to it, you will be mocked by the government representative. They'll say, like, do you have a court case behind you? You don't? Well, I mean, okay, go behind the queue, go behind the line, and you'll just be pushed away. So the judicial component, although it's a struggle, although it takes resources, often that the poor Métis community and broken surviving communities do not possess. And the Crown has obviously deep pockets in terms of expertise, as well as means, as well as appeals process. This all leads to a form of, like, it's problematic, let's put it that way, okay? So, but without this, it's really difficult for Métis people, any Métis people, to move forward, including the Eastern Métis people in this case. Fearing judicial extinctions, basically, or the recognitions associated with it, there is a problem I would like to highlight to you. It's the fact that Métis, due to this, they will internalize these criteria. They will essentialize themselves to these criteria, and they will rush themselves to form communities. They will rush themselves in examining their genealogy, you know, according to some quite in obsessive ways, right? Because they have to prove their ancestral connection to the Crown. They have to form communities in order to defend themselves. And they will often rush themselves into crimes in order to get charged, but without the adequate preparations in terms of scholarships, in terms of history, in terms of means, in terms of anything like that. And after that, they will be squashed by the process. And unfortunately, after this is done, their Indigenous rights and rights to exist, more fundamentally, will be quashed forever. So, you know, this is just the judicial kind of side to that story, adding to the social and political charge context that there is behind our work, so to speak. Moving a little bit quickly now, there's a rhetorical context, and this is more along the line of the accusations that you will find against the Eastern Métis online currently, or within universities, or within the research communities at large. Some of these arguments, we are, in full transparency, we are opposing these arguments, and we try to find solutions that are based on factual demonstrations and other forms of reasoning about that. But I like 6 for you here really quickly, and probably you heard this about, and it's not only just the Métis, it's in fact for many Indigenous people, these kinds of arguments are weaponized, for example, against C-31s in the 80s that were deemed lost to their communities, or marrying out types of argument, or blood quantum argument in order to push people away and make them feel bad. So one of the argument here in the top corner, you'll see that the Eastern Métis are labeled as people that would be only mixed, that having no oral tradition, no cultural transmission, no history, no politics, no peoplehood, and therefore no indigeneity, okay? So essentially these people would be fraud, or people wanting to become Indigenous because it's now the hype, or it's now cool to be Indigenous, right? It is argued. You will find Professor Chris Anderson and Adam Gaudry at the University of Alberta among those who advocate these kinds of arguments in their work, in their paper. The other square next to it is that the word Métis is only for the Western Métis due to a more mature collective consciousness. I've already addressed this aspect. It is held by the Métis National Council at the center of its doctrine. Other merely half-breed or small Métis, right? They did not capitalize the word, like major, M, big Métis and small Métis, right? Would be this kind of difference. I explained this to my kids with Harry Potter. Sometimes, in terms of the mixed blood, the bad mixed blood, and the pure blood sorcerer that would like to rule the world. I'm trying to make sense to this to my daughter that has a hard time understanding why the Eastern Métis are excluded out of these conversations. But that being said, you can find that argument in the work of Jacqueline Peterson, for example, the historian, that argues in our work, in like academic work, that in the Great Lakes, for example, in Ontario, she argues you don't find real Métis there because they wouldn't have the same degree of consciousness than the Red River Métis, built on this primordialist understanding, ethno-nationalist understanding of the Red River Métis Nation. So it's kind of a scaling, if you will, of the degree of maturity, which is a little bit bizarre when you think about it in terms of colonial studies, because these types of reasoning were applied by settler society to discriminate against Indigenous society from the get-go, to suggest that the Indigenous society didn't have laws, didn't have traditions, didn't have culture, didn't have nothing. Therefore, it was terra nullius and you could strip them away from this. I would like to suggest that we have kind of internalized these arguments into these conversations, and we're now pushing it against the segment of the most vulnerable Indigenous population in this country still seeking recognition. So another argument below is that if Métis ever existed in Quebec, because Quebec seems to be the problem now, and also the Maritimes province, they have been assimilated either by First Nations or by the Québécois, okay? So there's no middle ground for them. They've been necessarily assimilated. That's another argument you will find online to no end. And the mixed people in Quebec were never, they never used the word Métis, it is also argued. And if they did use the word Métis, they use it only in a racial way, right? Like race-based. It's not cultural, it's not national. They were talking about their mixture and not really their kind of self-understanding of themselves, or better, their communal understanding of themselves. And if ever they used the word Métis, then they surely didn't use the word Métis, or you cannot find any evidence of Bois-Brûlés in Quebec. It was argued to me some years back. Another famous argument is that there's statistical growth of the Eastern Métis, or the non-status people, even, if you will, represent a threat to the real Indigenous people that do have treaty at this point, or are negotiating for treaty or their rights. Because if everyone becomes Indigenous, so says the argument, well, no one will be Indigenous. Therefore, the Indigenous people is always perceived in a state of minority, right? It is conceived, it is assumed that for Indigenous people to exist, they have to be this special minority back to their kind of place, unfortunately. And only through that lens can we understand indigeneity. Obviously, I object to that argument, and I say that we are living in an Indigenous country, on Indigenous lands, And we shouldn't be surprised that Indigenous people, due to the battles of so many First Nations and Inuit across decades and centuries to survive, have inspired other Métis people to rise up to their own identity, relationship, and the possibility of resilience as well. So we shouldn't be surprised, and we should salute the fact that we may have a greater Indigenous populations in this country as a positive thing and not necessarily as a negative thing, I would suggest. Now, Eastern Métis are accused of being race shifters. Perhaps you have seen that. There's even a hashtag on it for Twitters. So race shifters, mere opportunists, too distant or too little ancestry, and carrier, even now, the new argument is that they are carrying false oral traditions or family lure. So this you will find in the work of Daryl Leroux, professor at St. Mary's University, which kind of makes its own niche. And he has a website called Race Shifting that tries to identify all the people that would be guilty of this, according to Professor Leroux. So this is just kind of a snapshot, if you will, at some of the arguments that we are seeing today along the debates. And this is just like in full transparency to show you the level of difficulties that you can have as a future student and as a future researcher in any given topic. There will be political interferences. If you're touching something important, you can expect resistance. And this is part of the resistance, right? A political charge context in a colonial setting. Then we move into a judicial context, quite loaded as well, quite demanding for these Indigenous populations that are ostracized and do not have the means to have like a fair access to justice. And then finally, it transfer into the academic field in the area of productions of knowledge, where you have like different arguments that are weaponized in such a way that unfortunately I have my share of students coming into my office that were crying because their identity was not only recognized, but just squashed completely in classes or in different contexts and scenarios. And there's huge problems with universities or institutions of knowledge lately because they are afraid of getting involved into these subject matters, especially against vocal Indigenous people that may object to these findings, and therefore threatening different organizations that if they are going about this work or giving it a platform, they will regret it and so on. So all of this is to identify the contours of what I have labeled prior, this toxic culture that for not only our sake, but for future generations, we have to move away from this because no one would be saved, including elders that are now fearful of telling their stories or kids to embrace their heritage if they are facing such a scenario. So the RCAP conclusion in wrapping again, right, just as a reminder, few Canadians are more exposed to their ethnicity to the risk of isolations and alienations than the other Métis. This was true 30 years ago. It is even truer today in the space of knowledge that we are facing. And to which I would add, and this is in my personal name, okay, I would add that the abusive generalizations and the stereotypical denigrations we are now seeing on social media and other places do articulate the very real possibility of hate crimes against an identifiable ethnic group, which is the Eastern Métis. And I'm calling this strongly because what I see is unacceptable. It's not acceptable for any ethnic or cultural or national group in Canada. It's not an acceptable language for the Eastern Métis as well. So all this to say at this point, and I'm watching time now, okay, we're doing good. So all this to say that this is a very charged subject, and you may think, Sebastian, are you completely crazy to go about this research? And do you even have students at this point that are ready to embark into this journey? I mean, yes, I do have students, and I take pride in doing this, but it is hard. I won't lie, it is hard on your mental health. It is hard on your personal esteem. It is hard on capacity. We have to do teamwork. In terms of these types of research and any types of research, we have to belong in teams. That's why community is so important. That's why we are networking with other people that offer supports. And I like to say to all the people that will go out in any given subject out there, if I can give it one token of inspiration, would be this. It would be to say that if you take the speech or the narration of someone, okay, someone speaks about things, and you take all the hatred away, all the hatred and all the evil, all the darkness, all the, the gossiping away, what is left? What is left of your narrative, of your discourse? What is left of you? What is left of what you're trying to build? If the answer to this is nothing, then you're dwelling in poverty. Okay, you need relationship. We need to go out of ourselves to reach, to relate to other people so that we can feed each other with appreciations and relatedness, truly, right? To feed ourselves and our human purpose, so to speak. So it's a good way to diagnose what's going on around you, because when you face like tough opposition by organization key members, you may feel isolated and alone. That will happen to you. Happens to me, happens to the people with whom I'm working and the communities that I'm collaborating with. A way out of this is to assess the situation and say that, take out all the hate, put it in the trash can, and see what is left. And what is left, then that's the subject of good conversations, good debate. We need to debate. We need to exchange ideas for our democratic society that would like to, be stronger. We need to have no censorship on these given subject and a respectful approach, hopefully, to it. So how do we write a book on this subject, given the landmines that we do have around us? So I have a few markers here. So first and foremost, the book, okay? If you want to read it for yourself, which I highly suggest, don't listen to me, go read the book. And after that, yeah, please email me and, contact us, the authors, and we can have conversations about this. But it is based on a case before the Quebec Superior Court at this point. I have to be transparent about this, right? The community of Maniwaki and one of their members is presently in court for a constitutional case, and they're trying to make the so-called Paoli cut for themselves, okay? So in this book, therefore, we are not stating any opinion on the judicial aspects of this case because it is still before the court, okay? So this book is about history, culture, and anthropological understanding and ethnological understanding of that culture, okay? That I'm going to get a little bit more specific about. We are working with this book in collaboration with the community of Maniwaki, and we have presented our results to the elders and the community members in Maniwaki when we were done and across all the stages of this making up, okay? For us, it was crucial to collaborate with the community, and the community didn't have the means to pay us, 3 authors, to do that work. So we did it pro bono, valuing the fact that as academic and as professors or as members of the knowledge community, it is kind of an obligations to the community, social service, so to speak, to go out and try to work for the betterment of this. Okay, so it's kind of a way to give back, so to speak, and to be present into these fields. This work is highly interdisciplinary, which means that it connects anthropology, history, and the field of cultural studies, for example, right? So we have built up on, bringing our expertise together, right? Guillaume Marcotte, historian of the fur trade, me with all the cultural studies that I did and the judicial aspects of the questions, and Michel Bouchard, a great anthropologist on these questions. We've put our mind together with so many other people that are not named, unfortunately. And some are named in the book, but there's so many other people that have affected our lives into pursuing this journey together. And it deploys what I call an innovative theoretical framework, which, I like to think allows diversity and identity fluidity to be accounted for. And we call this a risomatic approach. And the next slide will be about this, okay, to explain to you a bit further what is that contribution. But we think that within Métis culture, there's something very sacred and very special in terms of culture and in terms of cultural inputs. And it's from the onset, it is a beautiful culture open to diversity, fluid, that resists essentialisms and the squaring, the pair squaring of identity. It is, I like to think, almost an antidote to colonialisms and its willingness to slot people into identity categories, right? And essentialism. So that's why I oppose to the concepts of race shifting, because in order to say that race shift, you need to assume some form of essentialisms about these race, or at least a matter of perceptions, if I want to be charitable. Yes, there could be perceptions of race. There's no denial to that. There's huge problem linked with that in terms of weaponizations against specific minorities or populations. There's no questions with this. But in order to pursue individuals and community and tax them of shifting their identity and therefore being fraud, there's huge, obviously, problems with that assumes, especially for the Métis cultures, as I will explain it further. So we have deployed also what I like to think a very solid comparative methodology, And our analysis are based on historical documents and oral traditions, which are central into our understandings because we are dealing with people that are still alive. Okay, so we're not just going into books about this. Okay, so what is a rhizomatic approach and why? Essentially, prior to this book, Song Upon the River, that we wrote in 2016, is kind of a work that tries to map the existence of Métis culture all across North America, okay? And in order to understand the fluidity and the communities, we have deployed kind of a rhizomatic approach and theory to this book that we have perfected into this book and into further work that is coming now ahead, okay? Why do we say rhizomatic? Because Métis culture, you know, in our understanding of it, informed understanding of it, is syncretic, right? It brings Indigenous aspects with European aspects together, and it creates a unique culture specific to Turtle Island and specific to our lands. So it is born in the cultural and occupational niche, to be more precise, of the fur trade, okay, as an activity and as a culture, with the emergence of many interconnected bicultural European Indigenous settlements. So you have to see that the fur trade is kind of a pathway, a network, and across that there's different experience and points of contact with different Indigenous people, and that creates settlements of so-called free men and free women and free beings, okay? So it creates like pockets that are interconnected through cultural ways. So it's like a very complex system with multiple points of entries, so to speak, and radiance, all right? So this is why we claim in our theory that there's no one absolute center of origin for Métis cultures. There is Métis in BC, okay, as attested by Louis Riel himself, for example, in his writing in 1885, yeah. But there is 1885. Yeah, I have to take my English now. So there is different points of entry about Métis cultures, many centers of influence. Sault Ste. Marie, for example, right? Or in the north, or Red River is certainly a huge hub of Métis culture. Don't get me wrong on this. And most Métis were looking up to Red River as a center of leadership, obviously, due to very specific historical reason. But, you know, to the best of my understanding and my studying of Métis culture, including in Red River, never before 1983, Red River was upheld as an argument to be played against the recognitions of other Métis. This is quite new, in fact, okay? So in order to suggest another model, more fluid, more open to diversity, accepting of the fact that different people may have different experience along historical experience, we say rhizomatic, okay? Couch it in the fur trade culture, obviously. So why fur trade culture? Well, we say that the Métis are mobile, right? A mobile culture, people that have moved a lot, but they have moved a lot in line with the fur trades. The circuits of the fur trade were organizing their movement and their freedom from these circuits as well in very specific way. First Nations, to contrast, were very mobile cultures as well, obviously, but often in and out of that circuits, okay? If you want to understand the differences, so that's why First Nations were labeled often as hunters, and the fur trade Métis families were receiving different posted along these fur trade routes. Métis culture accumulates very distinctive practices and customs, which makes this culture, I'm telling you, culture recognizable. And this is our chapter 4, okay? So we've highlighted, not exhaustively, but we've highlighted key markers by which we can recognize the experience of Métis people across the fields, okay? Religion, the specificity of religion. So it's not just like Christian religion, because, you know, there is an understanding that the father, being predominantly of European descent, brings Catholicism or religion with it, and then this is merged with the Indigenous traditions of the woman, that merges very specific culture of Indigenous spiritual practice with some elements of Catholicism as well. So it brings a very special colorations to these traditions together, okay? So this is just one token, but there's also material cultures we have studied and so many other things by which we can identify the contours of that diasporic culture. As I've said, Métis are quite mobile within the fur trades, and they are under threat, or they're, so to speak, they have benefited from colonizations in terms of acts of penetrations into Indigenous culture. And there were sometimes, we have to say this, okay, guys, we have to have frank and honest conversation about this. Métis people were sometimes at the frontier, so to speak, of things, and were allowing colonizations to go further, not in an evil way, I would suggest, but in a way that European got further inland, so to speak, with the help of the trading Métis people and with the help of the cultural brokers. But when their role as cultural brokers diminishes or just vanishes, then the Métis also endure colonialisms. And therefore colonialisms is also undertaking a big split, so to speak, on Métis culture, targeting Métis culture in order to build its official understanding of Indianness, okay? I apologize for the term, but that's that. Okay, in order to lower the number of Indigenous people in this country, the government has designed colonial policy targeting the Métis, like coding the Indigenous identity, Indian identity along patrilineal coding, meaning that if your father was not reputed as an Indian by Indian agent, therefore you were assimilated or a Métis, and you were pushed away from reservations, pushed away from any services, pushed away from any promises that were made going back to 1763 and before that even. So this big split has to be explained in the way in which Métis people understand themselves. So I like to suggest that it gives rise to a specific indigeneity unique in the world of a diasporic genre in terms of Métis culture. And it's not reducible to Red River primordialisms. By this, I mean, you know, the belief or the ideological system that says that only in Red River and only from there do we find Métis culture and Métis forms of identity. We'd like to suggest that you find that identity in interrelations in so many different entry points and exit points, so to speak. So, but if we're not suggesting that, you know, Métis is a, you know, nation per se, and we have to study Métis from the lens of Métis nationalisms, what are we talking about, right? So just in order to be clear here, I'd like to say that we are not suggesting that Métis neo-nationalisms, as I call it in my work, doesn't have a right to exist. Okay, I want to be crystal clear about this. They have a right to exist. The Red River Métis nations, in my understanding, in my opinions, have an inherent right to limit their own membership and establish their own governance, okay? I mean, I'm saying it now, okay? So that to be clear, as do others, okay? And this is where I'm adding my little grain of salt, as do others, okay? We draw the line in terms of Métis nationalism's expression when these arguments are weaponized as to deny the existence of other Métis people. The Red River Métis Nation is a mighty and beautiful nation, and it doesn't need to denigrate any other Métis community or any other Indigenous people across this beautiful land, is my point, okay? We can coexist, and we can find that the culture, the Métis culture with different points of expression and different forms of appearances may take different political expressions as well, which are not limited to the canons of nationalisms, which has been mostly imported by Western political science and the way in which we understand what is specifically politics, okay? There is many other ways to think politically about ourselves, and I like to open that door for more freedom and a breezy air when it comes to that, all right? So, and in this, I'm not being an extraordinary, bizarre Sébastien Malette here, okay? I like to suggest that I follow the Métis Settlement General Council. When the Daniels case was rising, right, they made an intervention into the Supreme Court, and here's a paragraph that says that their organization, the only landowner in Alberta, right, so they're not Eastern Métis, they're Western Métis with their own settlements, they say, their organization, I quote, submits that it does not assist efforts at reconciliation to focus on divisive, politically territorial arguments, just as the diversity of Canada's Indian and Inuit can be recognized under Section 9124, so can the diversity of Métis be recognized. Okay, so and you see the rest of the quote, they are quite adamant in opposing this singular voice for all Métis. We need to coexist in diversity and plurality, and we need respect for that. So then, but if not primordialisms, how do we recognize Métis? You know, like people ask me, Malette on Twitter, what are you doing? You're talking about race, you're talking about bad stuff. You're like, you know, they're doing it gets moved all the way, right? So I just want to be clear about this as well in terms of motives.
Sebastian, we've got about 5 minutes
5
together
minutes,
here.
okay.
So
I won't have the time to go into all the details, but we have identified in our book common cultural markers, kinship structures, valuing the different dual cultural belonging, that valuation. We have also identified key aspects in terms of the experience of discrimination for Métis coming from different places, and also groupings of solidarity with an increasing level of fluidity that is associated with exogamic unions, the possibility to, because Métis people were not allowed to live on reserves, not allowed to form community in many cases. So they had to exist within their oral traditional families, right? Their oral traditions. So we have to value oral traditions in terms of assessing and accepting the differences of Métis culture all around these places. And this is what we have done in this book, going after specific cases. For example, Marie-Louise Riel, who was a healer in the region of Gatineau, that offers quite the living oral traditions, which I have studied myself. I have visited elders about this. I found some of the documents about it in the BNQ archives in Gatineau. So there is our oral traditions transmitted that we have documented into this book. There is also petitions from the Algonquins themselves due to colonial politics that are getting squeezed out of their lands and squeezed out of their communities. Sometimes we have to say it by Métis people coming back from the fur trade, looking for a way to survive themselves due to colonialisms. We have documented this reality to show that, in fact, there is a recognition of the Métis people, that we are not inventing this, and where we see it in priest narrations, we see it governmental narrations, we see it in the studying of the material cultures of it with these points of distinctions, we see it in oral traditions, and we see it also in the living testimonies of the descendant of these people, which in 1981, for example, were expressing during the constitutional negotiations leading to the recognitions of Section 35, the Métis in the Pontiac, which is the Outaouais, decades ago were saying, we are Métis. We have also been spoiled from our cultural rights, our trapping, forestry is eating all the lands. We have issues as well, and we would like to be heard. So this book, in closing, I would like to say, it's a testimony. I had prepared so many slides for you, but I guess I'm talking too much. But the rest of the slide, which I think you can share and are pretty self-explanatory by themselves, they expose key points and key quotes, which I think are, irrefutable in terms of collective and distinctive demonstrations of the existence of these people. And yes, it will shake Quebec historiography, of course. Yes, it will shake points of doctrines that have been politicized and weaponized by numbers of actors. But I think that there's always a place to make amends and say, I didn't know, it's interesting. In the light of these new facts, we can build conversations and we can see forward what we are hoping for our common destinies as Western, Eastern, Northern, Southern, Métis, as well as Canadians, Quebecois, Acadians, First Nations, and Inuit people. So I hope that at least that was like perhaps just 30% of the stuff that I wanted to show you today, but at least that will appeal to you to seize the book and read it for yourself and to see if the evidence are telling you the possibility of a great story.
Sebastian, thank you so much for sharing those voices of the people that you've researched who have been put down on paper. It's nice to hear the voices of those ancestors come to the surface. I want to also thank you in helping us as a school district and as a community try to figure out our own identity, our own sense of belonging on these territories that we serve, and helping us a little further down our path on how we might build a different Canada that includes all people and recognizes them for who they are.
Thank you. I appreciate this. And thank you again for inviting me and offering me the possibility of trying to reconcile
yes.
along that way.
Okay.
I just have one quick thing. I want to thank UBC Press. Sebastian, they've offered a 20% discount for all the books in our series using the code TRC57. So if you want to read this book or any of the books in our series, please go to UBC Press or our TRC website. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Ted.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.